Hi, Joey. You look very pretty today. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Hey, this month, all through September, our food distribution ministry is doing a collection of canned vegetables. They're specifically asking for canned corn, canned peas, and canned carrots. And I'll tell you that we desperately need your help with this. There was a time not so long ago when we got most of the food we needed from Dare to Care or Kentucky Harvest, but we don't get very much from them anymore. And so we really depend on you. We do these drives 4 times a year, every 3 months. And we just really need your help. So for the rest of the Sundays in September, if you can, just bring in all the canned vegetables you can. There are collection bins downstairs. You can drop them in any one of those. Appreciate your help with that. More importantly, there are hungry people out there, and they need your help with that. Amen? Amen. You know, I've heard our church described in many ways. Some of the descriptions are very flattering. Some of them are not. I've heard our church described in many ways, but I don't think I've ever heard anyone describe us as being a rich church. Like when you think of a rich church, this is probably not the first church you think of. You'd probably think of a church like Southeast Christian Church. That seems more like a rich church. But what is it that makes a church rich?
The Lord.
Is it big events and lots of ministries going on all the time? Is that what makes a church rich? Or is it the building? Is it the property? Is it the address that makes a church rich? Or just to be blunt, is it the bank account that makes a church rich? Well, clearly you're smart enough to see where I'm going with this. The truth is, it's none of those things. It's not the building, it's not the program, it's not even the money that makes a church rich. Last week we started a new sermon series on the letters to the 7 churches of Revelation. And remember, these 7 churches, they symbolize all churches throughout all generations. Which means that these are personal, handwritten letters that Jesus sent to me and he sent to you.
Yes.
This week we come to the second of the 7 letters, and this letter was originally sent to the church in a city called Smyrna. And this letter shows us very clearly what a rich church really looks like.
Okay.
Now, a couple quick things about this letter before we actually read the letter. This is the shortest of all the 7 letters. And the reason this is the shortest is because there's no criticism in it anyway. There is no rebuke from Jesus in this letter at all. Jesus looks at this church and he simply says this. To the angel of the church... Here we go. To the angel of the church in Smyrna, right. These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Amen. Now, just as we did last week, I want to start by telling you a little bit about the city where this church was located. So the city of Smyrna was known for a couple of things. One of the things was the whole city of Smyrna was built on a hill. And at the very top of this hill, there was a ring of temples that were built to honor pagan gods. So that ring of temples that sat at the top of the city, it looked like a crown. It looked like a crown on top of the city. And so Smyrna was often called the crown of Asia. I want you to remember that because we're going to come back to that. The crown of Asia. Another thing the city of Smyrna was known for was that it had been completely destroyed during the time of Alexander the Great, which was about 300 years before Christ. The whole city was destroyed in battle, and the city was just abandoned. For a long time, the city had just been abandoned, but then it was eventually rebuilt, and it became a thriving city again. And so Smyrna was also called the City of Life, because it was a city that had died and come back to life again. And I want you to remember that too. Remember both of those things, the crown of Asia and the City of Life. We're going to come back to both of those. And then the last thing you should know about the city of Smyrna was that it was very loyal to Rome. Like the people of Smyrna, they were proud to be Roman citizens. They had no problem at all worshiping Caesar as though he were a god. Which is exactly what Caesar required of everyone in the Roman Empire. You had to worship Caesar as Lord. And of course, that's one of the things that got those early Christians in so much trouble. They refused to worship Caesar as Lord. And in a city like Smyrna, where so many people were so loyal to Caesar, it made it very difficult for Christians indeed. Very difficult for Christians in the city of Smyrna. And that's why Jesus begins this letter by saying, I know your afflictions and your poverty. And again, the afflictions that Jesus speaks of here, they are the result of one thing. It's because the Christians of Smyrna were loyal to Jesus and not to Caesar. There were about 250,000 people in the city of Smyrna. Almost all of them were either Romans or Jews. And the Romans persecuted the Christians because they wouldn't worship Caesar. The Jews persecuted the Christians because they worshiped Jesus.
Yes, yes.
And so they lived under constant affliction. There was no escaping it. It was all around them every day. How comforting it must have been to hear Jesus say, I know your afflictions. You know, we face afflictions in our Christian lives too, don't we? Being a Christian in our world today is getting more and more difficult. We face more and more persecution. We enjoy less and less freedom. It's a lot of pressure trying to be a Christian in the world today. Trying to raise Christian children and be Christian parents and be Christian friends and Christian neighbors and Christian employees. It's a lot of pressure. Trying to always be responsible, always do the right thing, always be kind, always represent Jesus in the world. It's a lot of pressure on us. But Jesus tells us the same thing he told them. He tells us, I know your pressure.
Amen.
And I know your affliction. And listen, he does.
Amen, he does.
Oh, when Jesus says he knows your affliction, he does. Jesus lived in poverty and persecution.
Yes, yes.
He was rejected. He was outcast. In the end, he was beaten and he was crucified. So when Jesus says he knows your affliction, you better believe he does.
Amen.
And when someone who really loves you knows what you're going through, that can be a great source of comfort, can't it? And Jesus tells you, I know your affliction. And then Jesus acknowledges something else. He acknowledges their poverty. Now, in the New Testament, there were two different Greek words that were used for poverty. The first one is a term that described people that we might call the working poor. They were people who just barely made enough, you know. They just barely made enough to feed their families and clothe their children, and then they didn't have anything left after that. But then the second term for poverty described people who didn't even have that. They didn't have enough food to eat. They didn't have clothes for their children. Maybe they didn't have a home to live in. And the reason those Christians in Smyrna were living in poverty like that, listen, it's not because they were lazy. It's not because there was no work available for them. It's not because there was a famine. They were hungry and they were homeless because they weren't even allowed to conduct business and go to work and earn a living. They weren't even allowed to participate in the society around them. I want you to think for just a moment how courageous those first Christians were. Because at any point, they could have turned their backs on Jesus and life would have gotten a whole lot easier for them.
Yes, yes.
At any point, they could have said, look, I don't know what I was thinking with all this Jesus stuff. Of course I'll worship Caesar as Lord. All they had to do was say that, and life would have gotten a whole lot more comfortable for them. But they didn't do that. They chose to hold on to Jesus and live a difficult life rather than let go of Jesus and live an easier life. It's really hard for us to even imagine a choice like that.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the choice they faced. Food, shelter, warmth, and acceptance, or Jesus. It's hard for us to even imagine a choice like that because we live in a time and place where we can have both. Right? We can have great jobs, great houses, be loved by everybody, and still worship Jesus. Is that true? Can we have all the creature comforts and still follow Jesus? I'm not so sure. I don't know. Listen, I can't help but wonder how many of your comforts would disappear if you started taking Jesus with you everywhere you went.
Preach, Theo.
You start talking about Jesus at work. Start talking about Jesus at school. Start praying in public places. Or if you go out there and dare to speak out against gay marriage. If you dare to call sin, sin. If you dare to make any moral judgments. Or if you speak about hell like it's a real place, listen, you'll probably lose your job too. And you probably lose more than that. You might lose your reputation. You might lose some friends. You might lose some family. You might lose your home. You might lose a whole lot of things if you started taking Jesus with you everywhere you went.
Amen.
It's easy for us to think that we are very far removed from that situation in Smyrna. But we might not be so far removed from it after all. Those Christians in Smyrna were living in extreme poverty. But listen, it was poverty that they had chosen rather than choosing to turn their backs on Jesus.
Yes.
Amen.
So they are dirt poor. But look what Jesus says to them next. He says, I know your poverty, and yet you are rich. What was the question I asked you at the beginning of this sermon? What is it that makes a church rich? Well, here's your answer right here. Not from my mouth, but straight from the mouth of Jesus. A church that is rich is a church where the people would accept any hardship before they would turn their backs on Jesus. They would choose physical poverty over spiritual poverty every time. They would go hungry and they would go homeless, but they would not go without Jesus. In other words, the church that is rich is the church church that depends on Jesus for everything they have.
Amen.
Those Christians in Smyrna, they depended on Jesus for everything they had because they couldn't depend on anything else. There was nothing else for them to rely on. And Jesus told them they were rich for it. And look, I don't know how many of you know what it's like to be hungry and have nothing to eat. I don't know how many of you have ever had to sleep outdoors because you didn't have anywhere else to go. I don't know if you've ever been cold and had no way to get warm, but I do know this. If you have ever experienced that kind of poverty and you still held on to Jesus, you are very rich indeed.
Amen.
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 Sometimes you never realize that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all that you have.
Amen. Amen.
You know, it's not easy to preach about the virtues of a church like Smyrna these days. Because most congregations in our country, they don't really want to hear about the cost of being a Christian. They just want to hear about the rewards of being a Christian. Most American Christians are well clothed and well fed and well housed, and they don't want to hear about a brand of Christianity that doesn't include those things.
Preach, Theo.
That's why most of the popular preachers in this country are what we call health and wealth preachers. Right? They preach this health and wealth gospel, and all they ever talk about is how Jesus wants you to have victory in your finances, and victory in your relationships, and victory in your health. But if that's true, then why didn't Jesus have those things? Jesus lived in poverty. He had no place to lay his head. He was often hungry. And those apostles of Jesus, those first 12 that he chose, look, they never gained any wealth. Their lives were always in danger. Most of them got executed. And very few of those early Christians had any victory in their finances or any other kind of victory in this world for that matter. The reality for Jesus, the reality for his apostles, and the reality for most of the early Christians was that they lived in physical poverty. But even in their physical poverty, they had incredible spiritual power.
Yes.
Look, I want you to see this point. They lived in poverty, but they had great spiritual power. I look out at the Christian landscape today, and it's like it's just the opposite.
Amen.
I see a whole lot of Christians living in physical wealth, but they don't have any spiritual power. And I just got to ask you, like in the grand scope of things, what do you value more? Worldly riches or spiritual power? Those Christians in Smyrna, they didn't have any worldly riches, but they had incredible spiritual power. And Jesus wrote to them and he said, I know your poverty and yet you are rich.
Yes.
Amen. It reminds me of a beautiful poem I read once that said, I counted dollars while God counted crosses. I counted gain while he counted losses. I counted my worth by the things gained in store, but he sized me up by the scars that I wore. I coveted honors and sought for degrees. He wept as he counted the hours on my knees. I never knew till one day by a grave how vain are the things that we spend life to save. I did not yet know till a friend from above said, rich is the one who is rich in God's love. So those Christians in Smyrna, they were facing pressure and persecution and poverty unlike anything we'll ever know. Jesus at this point, and you saw your faithful followers suffering like that, what would you want to say to them? Or what would you want to do for them? Because I know for me, like if I was Jesus, I would want to punish those people who were persecuting my followers. At the very least, I would want to tell my followers, it's all going to be over. It's going to be better real soon. Just hang on, don't worry. It's all going to be okay. That's what I'd want to say if I were Jesus. But that is not what Jesus said. It's not even close. What Jesus said was, do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. So check this out. First, Jesus says, I know your afflictions and your poverty. And then he says, but it's about to get even worse. He said, I know you've already suffered a great deal, but you're going to have to suffer some more. But don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You've already suffered, now you're going to have to suffer some more. Listen, if anybody ever starts preaching that health and wealth gospel to you, you just show them that verse right there. Amen. Because I'm telling you the truth when I tell you that Jesus never promised anybody an easy path through this world.
No.
Jesus never promised anybody health or wealth or comfort. What he often promised was persecution and suffering and trial.
Yes, yes.
That is certainly what he promised those Christians in Smyrna. He said, I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. If you want to know what Jesus promised, there it is. He promised them suffering, and he promised them persecution. But he also promised them that they didn't have to be afraid.
Amen.
And you don't have to be afraid either. And I'll tell you why. Because like that verse said, the devil might test you, the devil might tempt you, but the devil cannot take you.
Amen.
You belong to the Lord. You don't have to be afraid. Jesus also says that suffering and persecution will last for 10 days, which is just another way of saying it's only temporary.
Yes.
That's all Jesus is saying here. It's temporary.
Yes, yes.
Of course, everything in this world is temporary, right? This whole world is temporary. But there is another world.
Yes, sir. Yes.
There is another world that is just as real as this world. Only this other world, it's not temporary. It's eternal. It's going to last forever. And in this other world, there's no more suffering and persecution. There's just life and love and joy and peace forever.
Hallelujah.
And that's what Jesus promises them. He says, be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life.
Yes, yes.
Jesus says, you be faithful in this world, and I'll open the door to the next world.
Amen, amen, amen.
You guys see the message here? Persecution, pressure, poverty, prison, and yet you are rich. And why are you rich? Because you have the crown of life.
Yes, yes. Jesus.
And because you have the crown of life, you don't have to be afraid of anything in this world, because you're not defined by this world anymore. You're defined by the world to come.
Amen.
So you can live without fear in this world, and you can face any hardship in this world, and you can be faithful even to the point of death, because Jesus promises you the crown of life.
Amen, amen.
He promised you the crown of life. That's a big promise to make. Whew. Hey, that's a powerful promise right there. And we all know that a promise is only as good as the person who makes it. Right? Those are some good words we've looked at this morning. But who is it that says those words? See, because the question we really have to answer is, the person who said he can do those things, can he really do them?
Amen.
Right? That's the question we have to answer. Well, as we've already said, Jesus is the author of those words. Jesus makes us that promise, and Jesus can keep that promise.
Amen.
And here's why. In verse 8, Jesus told you two very important things about himself. He said, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I am the first and the last, Jesus said. Jesus says there is pressure, and there is persecution, and there's poverty, and there's prison, and there's the promise of even more suffering to come. But even in the middle of all that, you are rich, and you don't have to be afraid, because I am the first and the last. And what he means is, I was there before any of that stuff began, and I'll be right there when it's over. I'm the first and the last. So, amen. Amen. So look, whenever you're facing trials and troubles in this world, you just remember that. Jesus tells you, I was right there with you at the beginning of it. I'll be right there with you at the end of it. I'll be with you all the way through it, because I'm the first and the last. Amen. Amen. I'm not going anywhere. I have always been with you, and I always will. I'm the first and the last. Got a little worked up there. So Jesus says that he's the crown of life, and he says that he died and came to life again. You remember those two things that the city of Smyrna was known for? I told you, remember those things, right? The city of Smyrna was called the crown of Asia, because it had that ring of temples around the top. Jesus says, crown of Asia, that's nothing. I'll give you the crown of life. And what was the other thing the city of Smyrna was known for? City of life. And he died and come back to life again. Jesus says, I did that too.
Amen.
I died and came back to life too. And so can you.
Amen. Yes.
The Christians in Smyrna held on to their faith no matter what came their way, because they knew that the crown of life was waiting for them. And they knew that one day they would look back on all their trials and troubles in this world, and they would see that that stuff wasn't even worth comparing to the glory that was theirs in heaven. They knew exactly what the Apostle Paul had said. I consider that our present sufferings aren't even worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us. Amen. Hey, Jason, would you join me back up on the stage? You know, there is always a great deal of suffering and troubles and trials right here in our church family. Never stop. Doug Taylor just finished a long round of cancer treatment. Tom and Grace Brown are going through cancer treatments right now. The Davidson family are going through trials that are just heartbreaking. Mark and Kathy Braun's whole family is going through a trial right now that is going to test the strength of their faith. But do you know what's beautiful? All those people I just mentioned, they're all here this morning. They're still here. And I'll tell you why. They figured out that it's a whole lot better to go through a trial with God than to go through a trial without Him. So they're suffering, they're hurting, but they are here. And I know that they're not the only ones. I know that there are many others who are hurting today, and yet you're here. And for every one of you that is hurting today, for everyone that's going through a trial today, I want to honor you for being here, even in the middle of your pain. More importantly, Jesus wants to honor you for being here, even in the middle of your pain. So before you leave today, look one more time at the message that Jesus sent to you. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown. I'm not going to introduce our invitation any more than that today. The altar is open. If you're hurting, if there's a trial, just come and stand on that cross. Just pour your pain out to God. But the altar is open for any who would